Yeah, I'm actually super excited for this episode. Let's start. So, hey, are you ready to explore yourself? Let's start. In this episode, we will cover the topic of trauma. This episode, it will be broken down to four segments. Segment one, it will talk about what is trauma. We will define any trauma in a simple definition. We will talk about how we can know if we have trauma, why do trauma even happen, and we will cover the types of trauma. Also, we will mention some common misconceptions about trauma that are very common between people, but actually they're wrong. In segment two, we will cover how trauma affects us in terms of mental health, difficulty concentrating. It also impacts the body. We will also cover the behavior and emotional reactions for trauma, impacts on relation and identity. And in segment three, we will cover coping strategies or mechanisms for healing from trauma. We will discuss the unhealthy coping strategies and the healthy coping strategies so everyone can identify what they're doing is right or wrong. And lastly, in segment four, we will cover post traumatic growth. We will mention examples of growth area, and I'm going to share with you a quick story about someone who experienced post traumatic growth. And lastly, we'll have a conclusion to wrap everything and to remember the last few points. Let's start with our episode. So, let me ask you a question in the beginning. Have you ever felt like your past experiences still affect you today? That's what trauma feels like. Let's explore how to understand and heal from it. So, trauma is when we experience a very stressful, frightening, or distressing event that are difficult to cope with or out of control. It could be one incident or an ongoing event that happens over a long period of time. Maybe it didn't happen to you, it happened to your parents, like your dad hurting your mom. It may result into you being scared of men and traumatized from them, even though no one did anything for you. Most of us will experience an event in our life that could consider traumatic, but we won't all be affected the same way. Trauma can happen at any age and can affect us anytime, including a long time after the event happened. Most importantly, and you have to remember this, trauma doesn't always come from extreme events. It can also stem from situations that seem ordinary but feel overwhelming. How can we know that we have trauma? Not everyone responds to trauma in the exact same way, but here are some common signs that you may face. You may face cognitive changes, intrusive thoughts, nightmares, and flashbacks of the event, confusion, difficulty with memory and concentration, and mood swings, or alerted behavior patterns, avoiding people and places or objects that remind you of this experience, and withdrawing from family, friends, and activities that you once enjoyed. It can be as simple as a jacket that you're wearing in this event. It can also be psychological concerns, anxiety and panic attacks, fear, anger, obsession and compulsion, shock and disbelief, emotional numbing and detachment. It can also be depression, shame, guilt, especially if the person dealing with the trauma survived while others did. But this is in extreme cases like a war or, or turmoil. It can also be in the shape of physical problems, difficulty falling or staying asleep, unexplained aches and pains, alerted eating patterns, muscle tension, and extreme exhaustion, which can be visible in the first few months. You must know that trauma isn't common between people, like social anxiety, for example, so you can't really diagnose yourself. Actually, no one can diagnose themselves with any mental disorders. These videos are just guidance for you if you felt similar struggles to assure you that you're not alone and how you can manage it. But you should always refer back to a doctor, psychiatrist, psychologist, therapist, anyone who is professional in this field. You may be wondering, why do trauma even happen? It can happen because you had been directly harmed or neglected, which is mostly by parents, or witnessing the harm to someone else, as I mentioned before, or living in a traumatic atmosphere like war or turmoil, as I mentioned, or being affected by trauma in a family or a community, including trauma that has happened before you were even born. Also, there are some groups that are most likely to experience trauma than others, and they experience it more often. These people include people of color, people who have served, or have been serving in the military, people who are in prison or have been in prison in the past, refugees and asylum seekers, people experiencing poverty. All these groups are most likely to, to experience trauma, but again, you can't diagnose yourself. Let's move on to types of trauma. Did you know that there are different types of trauma? They can all affect us differently, but they share one thing in common that challenge our ability to cope. Today, I'll briefly touch with you on three main types of trauma: acute, chronic, and complex. First, let's start with acute trauma. This happens when you experience a single overwhelming event, like a serious accident or a natural disaster, or a sudden loss, leaving a lasting impression on our minds and body. Next, there we have chronic trauma. This occurs over a long period of time and involves repeated exposure to the stress. For example, growing up in a household with constant conflicts, dealing with bullying, or living in a war zone. Chronic trauma can be particularly harmful when it builds over time and chips away at our sense of safety. And finally, we have complex trauma. This happens when someone else faces a couple of ongoing traumatic events, often starting with childhood. It may involve abuse, neglect, or any situation where a person feels powerless for a long time. Complex trauma can deeply affect how we see ourselves, others, and the world around us. Understanding these types of trauma may help us realize that everyone experiences differently, and that's okay. What matters how we support ourselves and each other in the healing process, whether it's a one-time event or years of struggle. No form of trauma is too small to deserve attention and care. Something that I extremely want to talk about is some common misconceptions about trauma. That it's only a big event like a natural disaster, serious accidents, or life threatening situations that only count as trauma. This couldn't be further from truth. Trauma can result from any experience that overwhelms our ability to cope. It could be something like bullying, facing constant academic pressure, or losing a close friendship. And yes, losing a close friendship can extremely affect us and cause us trauma. And actually, we'll find an episode about it. I think this episode is going to be episode 5, and the effect of breaking friendships and relationships is going to be episode 7, which actually may be or may not be my last episode. Let's continue with the common misconception. What's traumatic for someone may not be for another. For example, two people could experience the same situation, like their parents divorcing. One might deeply feel affected, while the other may not feel much change. And that's okay. Everyone processes trauma differently, and there's no right or wrong way to feel. The key takeaways here is to recognize and validate your feelings rather than comparing them to someone else. And this is not only about trauma, this is about all aspects of mental health. Comparing to other people can extremely harm you, while it won't really harm anyone else. You're just punishing yourself for something that you didn't do. Let's move on to segment 2: how trauma affects us as teenagers. It can affect our mental health. It's one of the major effects of trauma. For instance, some people develop post traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. This condition can cause flashbacks, vivid memories of the traumatic event, or nightmares. People with PTSD might feel anxiety, like they're constantly on the edge. As teens, trauma also show up in a more suitable way, like having difficulty in concentrating in school or withdrawing from friends and family. If you feel overwhelmed and disconnected after a stressful experience, that's your brain's way of processing what happened. We also have physical manifestation trauma. It doesn't only affect the mind, it also impacts the body. Let's talk about the fight, flight, or freeze response. This is how our brain, specifically amygdala, reacts to danger. It's a survival mechanism that prepares us to either confront, threat, escape, or shut down entirely. The tricky part is that trauma can cause this response to activate when there's no immediate danger. This might lead to physical symptoms like stomach aches, headaches, or fatigue. Stress from trauma can put a strain on your body, which is why it's important to care for both our physical and mental health. Guys, always remember that physical and mental health work hand to hand. So we can't really take care of one and ignore the other or say it's okay, I'm fine, and it will go by time. No, it won't. Either your physical or your mental health. Let's move on to behavioral and emotional reactions of trauma. This can also change the way that we behave and feel. You might notice behavioral changes like acting out, avoiding social situations, or taking risks on this emotional side. People often experience irritability, sadness, or even numbness, like they're detached from their emotions. We also have impacts on relationships and identity. Finally, trauma can affect how we relate to others and how we see ourselves. For teens, this might mean struggling to trust people or feeling disconnect from your sense of identity. You may feel like you don't recognize yourself or your place in the world. These feelings can be overwhelming, but they're a normal part of healing the process. And as I said, never ever diagnose yourself with anything regarding mental health, specifically for a topic like trauma. Like trauma, trauma is a very broad and complicated topic. But if you feel like you relate to this episode, you can go visit someone or talk with someone that might help you. Actually, now we're going to be talking about the coping mechanisms and healing. There are two types of coping mechanisms, healthy and unhealthy. Let's start with the unhealthy in order to avoid them. Unhealthy coping strategies, including avoidance, pretending that trauma didn't happen or avoiding anything that reminds you of it, or substance abuse, using drugs or alcohol to numb your feelings or escape from the pain. While these provide temporary relief, they don't address the root of the problem, which can lead to more issues on the long run. Let's move on to the healthy coping strategies. Thankfully, there are healthier ways to process and heal from trauma. Let's talk about it. First thing is to communicate your feelings. Sharing your experience with someone you trust, like a friend, family member, or a counselor, can incredibly be healing. There is also therapeutic techniques. I know it's hard to admit that you need therapeutic help, but trust me, if you need help, you should seek it. You're only harming yourself. These therapeutic techniques include cognitive behavior therapy, known as CBT. It helps you reframe negative thoughts and develop healthier patterns. Or EMDR, which is a therapy specifically designed for trauma, which uses eye guided movements to help us process the traumatic memories. Let me tell you some practical tips for self care that you can do on your own. You can start by journaling. Writing about your feelings or memories can help you make a sense of them. Or grounding techniques. For example, the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method. Name five things that you see, four things that you feel, three things that you hear, two two things that you smell, one thing that you can taste. And this brings you back to the present moment. You can also try mindfulness. Apps or simple breathing exercises can help you calm your mind and body. Physical activity. Exercise like sports or yoga can help you release pen down stress and improve your mood. And most effective is running, specifically in open air, like a garden and sand. It clears your mind, in addition of making you more productive. I know that sometimes sports can seem like overwhelming or that you don't have time, but in the next episode, we'll learn about how much sports are important in our life. Actually, in the next episode, we have such a special guest that I'm extremely excited to share with you. And lastly, support systems. Having a strong support system is crucial. Friends, teachers, and family members can create a safe environment for healing. If you were feeling isolated, consider reaching out to your online communities or helplines that are designed for teens. You can actually find these helplines on Google. And lastly, let's talk about post traumatic growth. What is post traumatic growth? Did you know that going through trauma can sometimes lead to positive changes? This is called post traumatic growth. It means finding new strengths or perspectives, overcoming a difficult experience. Examples of growth areas can be in resilience, as becoming a stronger or more adaptable in the face of challenges. Relationships. developing a deeper connection with other or feeling more empathy. And lastly, perspective, gaining a greater appreciation of life or discovering a new goal and passion. Last part of this episode will be sharing with you a small story about someone who experienced post-traumatic growth. So, Mia, a high school student who faced severe bullying in her early teens for a long time. Mia felt isolated and struggled with self-esteem. But instead of letting it define her, she began journaling and practicing self-care. Over time, strengthening her experiences and started a peer support at her school. Through this, Mia didn't only build a deeper connection with others, but also discovered her passion for helping people. Today, she's pursuing the career in counseling to guide others through their struggles. And by the way, I found this story on the internet. So let's wrap up everything and remember the few key points. Trauma is a response for a difficult experience, and it can affect healing takes time. Generally, anything in mental health, but it's possible. Feel free to share your thoughts and feedback or questions for future episodes. Thank you for listening to Teens Talk. See you next time, and most importantly, stay curious about yourself.